Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Freedom House's Freedom in the World 2011, the Authoritarian Challenge to Democracy. My name is David Kramer. I am the Executive Director of Freedom House, and I want to welcome all of you here today for a discussion of the findings of Freedom House's latest annual report. This is a report that has been issued since 1972, and it's a report that I think many people await for the rankings and then in a few months' time narratives that follow to discuss the state of political rights and civil liberties in countries around the world, and in fact all countries around the world, as well as a number of territories. And to be clear, the findings in the report do reflect the state of political rights and civil liberties in countries. They do not necessarily reflect the actions of governments, though of course actions of governments do factor in to the findings that we come out with. Freedom in the World has been gauging development of freedom since 72, as I mentioned, and has gone through analysis of the third wave, as it was called by Samuel Huntington, from the mid-1970s for nearly a quarter of a century. But more in the past decade or so, we've seen the spread of freedom slow down, and in fact, in the past 5 years, as my colleague Arch Puddington will describe, we've even seen development of freedom reverse. Today in Doha, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton delivered remarks at the Forum for the Future Partnership Dialogue panel session, and in those comments the Secretary made reference to the importance of civil society and non-state actors, and she also, I think, aptly said that those who cling to the status quo may be able to hold back the full impact of their country's problems for a little while, but not forever. If leaders don't offer a positive vision and give young people meaningful ways to contribute, others will fill the vacuum. And that, I think, is very apt for today's discussion, and we are very pleased that we have an expert panel for the discussion after Arch gives the presentation of today's findings. We also come here today when we see many signs of trouble around the world, whether it's the recent demonstrations in Tunisia, whether it is the rigged election and terrible violence in Belarus in December, the verdict in the Khodorkovsky case and the arrest and sentencing of Boris Nemtsov in Russia, religious strife in Egypt and Pakistan, and almost weekly repression of dissidents in China. Around the world we see problems, including also in Venezuela. All of these issues I expect will be addressed and discussed today with this panel. We're very pleased to have Susan Glasser, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, join us to moderate today's discussion, and it includes the Honorable Michael Posner, the Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Very pleased to have him with us. To his left is Tom Malinowski, the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch, and sitting to Arch's left is Elliot Abrams, who is at the Council on Foreign Relations, a Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies, and former Deputy National Security Advisor in the Bush administration. Now it is my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Arch Puddington, who's the Director of Research at Freedom House and who has been doing these reports for a number of years and is really the one that pulls all this together. But I also do want to acknowledge a few other people before I turn the podium over to Arch. Eliza Young, who played an extremely important role in pulling the report together as assistant editor, I think is here. Oh yes, I'm sorry, you're right in front of you, you disappeared. Eiley Piano also played a very important role as a managing editor. Tyler Rowlands is the chief editor, proofreader on this. We had Chris Walker, who I saw a little while ago, director of studies at Freedom House in our New York office. Arch, of course. But also I want to thank Sarah Trister and Mary McGuire and Paula Schriefer for really pulling today's event together, and also for the other meetings that folks at Freedom House have had to brief people at the State Department, the National Security Council, and other places. So without further ado, let me turn the podium over to Arch, and thank you again for coming. Arch.
Thanks. So the main story for Freedom in the World for the year 2010 is that freedom declined throughout the world for a fifth straight year. This is the first time in the history of Freedom in the World, which had its inaugural edition in 1972, that freedom has declined for a period that long. The narrative of freedom in the world from 1975 until 2000 was the same narrative that Samuel Huntington talked about when he wrote his book about the third democracy revolution. We charted that in Freedom in the World. From 1975 to 2000, we saw steady gains every year. From 2000 to 2010, we've seen a stagnation and then a decline. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the state of decline. There are 87 countries that we see as free. That's 87 out of 194. There are 115 countries we designate as electoral democracies. That's a majority of countries in the world. So the gains that we saw between 1975 and 2000, by and large, those gains still obtain, but the gains are fragile in many cases and they are eroding. The region that we're most concerned about, at least on the basis of this past year's results, is the Middle East. The Middle East is the one region in the world that did not experience a democratic revolution. However, between the years 2000 and 2005, the Middle East showed some signs of progress. They were encouraging. They were modest, but they were positive. Between 2005 and 2010, those gains have eroded, and basically the Middle East in 2010 is in the same condition as it was in 2000. And of the various declines that we've observed over the past year, the most significant came in Egypt, where you had an election that was not just rigged, but it was blatantly rigged. The Americas is another area I'd like to refer to. There were two important declines. One, and this was for Freedom House, a very painful decline, came in Mexico. Mexico we had rated as free. We had seen it as a country that under Vicente Fox and then President Calderon had made important gains in consolidating its democratic institutions. However, the violence, the drug-related violence that has infected so many of Mexico's states has gotten out of hand to the point where it is having an impact on the press, on local governance, on the ability of people to go about the streets and do their business. So for that reason, Mexico's Freedom House designation declined from free to partly free. Venezuela also experienced yet another year of decline. This was a kind of up and down year for Venezuela. The up came in September when the political opposition got itself reasonably unified, pushed during parliamentary elections, and actually won 52% of the vote, though because of gerrymandering they only won about 40% of the parliamentary seats. The down came in December when a totally Chavista parliament passed a series of 30 or so laws which further constricted freedom of the press and freedom of expression, took another whack at the rights of NGOs to do their thing, and then handed President Chavez another 18 months in which he can rule by decree on the most significant issues. The former Soviet Union, another problematic region, we actually saw some modest signs of hope in a few countries. There were gains in Kyrgyzstan, which moved up from not free to partly free, in Georgia, and in Moldova. The one important negative movement came in Ukraine. Ukraine had a decent election early in the year, but after Viktor Yanukovych was inaugurated as president, things just went from one negative development to another. The judiciary was politicized. NGOs were aggressed on. The freedom of the press was circumscribed. And finally, towards the end of the year, there were local and regional elections that were poorly handled by any measurement. So for those reasons, Ukraine moved from free to partly free. It had been the only country in the region that had been designated as free. And basically what you have in the former Soviet Union are freedom scores that are really not much higher than the scores in the Middle East right now. Two other countries I want to make very brief mention of. One is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka declined rather considerably. Sri Lanka had been involved in a decades-long conflict with the Tamil Tigers. They finally defeated the Tigers. They have had a great opportunity to make peace with society, to bring the Tamil people back into the population, and to move ahead with the consolidation of democratic institutions. And in fact, President Rajapaksa has moved exactly in the opposite direction, ignoring the plight of those whose lives were disrupted by the conflict, accumulating more and more power for himself and his family, and persecuting the political opposition. And finally, there was Ethiopia, another country that has a strategic relationship with the United States, that moved from partly free to not free because, again, of blatantly rigged elections. Now, I want to go through one more thing, and that is one more exercise, and just to look at what's happened over the past 10 years. We actually have a visual for you that shows you how things looked in between 2002 and 2006. Eliza, is it up there? Okay. Just sit here for a second. Darkest blue represents the greatest gains. The two lighter blue shades show the somewhat less significant gains, but they were gains nonetheless. And then the reddish colors are those countries that declined, and the deeper the red, the worse the decline. Okay. The next map, there we are, shows a much more substantial red map that shows you the declines and gains between 2006 and 2010. And basically what that shows you is that where there were mainly gains the first 5 years, there were overwhelmingly declines over the second part of the decade. What were the institutions that declined? Actually, elections were an institution that did not decline. Elections, according to our data, stayed rather static. And it was the most impressive performance among any of our democratic indicators. The institutions that showed the most significant declines are corruption and effective governance, freedom of the press and expression, freedom of association, which is trade unions, but it's also, and in this case mainly, the right of NGOs to function as they should, and most significantly, rule of law. So the basic story of this past 5 years is that autocrats are willing to have elections as long as they can control the press, as long as they can pay off their cronies, as long as they can smother the NGO sector, especially in those countries where NGOs are coming in to play the opposition role that political parties used to play, and especially where they can politicize and control the judiciary. Thank you.
Art, thank you so much for that terrific overview. We have such a terrific panel today, too. I want to thank David and everyone at Freedom House for including all of us in this discussion. This is such a definitive group of people. I'm sure everybody, and not just me, has questions, so I'll try to get to yours as well as my own in the course of the conversation today. I thought we'd just start off actually by jumping right in where Arch left off, and to sort of go down the panel and get a sense, in a broad sense, do these findings, do you agree with them? Do they startle you? What is your number one takeaway as you look at the overview this year? Tom, do you want to get us started on that?
Sure. Well, I'm obviously not surprised. These trends are pretty obvious to all of us who work on these issues. It's also not surprising because I think the trend that you're describing was somewhat inevitable. It followed a period in the 1990s following the fall of the Soviet Union, the extraordinary rise of influence of the human rights movement, changes in countries like Indonesia and much of Latin America in the direction of greater respect for democracy and human rights. The internet, which linked together all of these civil society movements around the world, helped them organize better. All these things led to a very long and steady and positive trend in the direction of greater freedom. And I think the pushback to that was inevitable because this isn't a game. The work that we do and activists around the world do in pursuit of greater democracy and human rights poses an existential threat to leaders of authoritarian countries, many of whom are perfectly capable of using extreme violence to defend their interests. And so we saw that over the last 5 years in a number of parts of the world. And that pushback also coincided with a period in which the United States lost some of its credibility as the world's most prominent and powerful defender of democracy and human rights, in part because of some of the troubling things we did in the last decade in fighting terrorism, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, etc., and partly, and I think probably in a larger measure now, in particular because of the economic crisis, which made our model less attractive to many people around the world, while at the same time an alternative model associated with, at least temporarily, a more economically successful great power, China, became more prominent. So I think none of this, if you look at it in that context, is all that surprising. At the same time, I don't think the idea that we defend is in weaker shape today around the world. The tensions we are seeing in countries like Tunisia and Egypt in the last few weeks, in Burma, in many other parts of the world where these crackdowns against democratic movements and civil society are in full force, what those tensions suggest is that in those countries, people continue to take great risks to champion the rule of law and democracy and freedom and liberty, and that those values continue to be championed in a way that causes governments to push back. And even in China, we see the parts of the leadership, including the prime minister, asserting that the alternative authoritarian model may not be sustainable over the long term. So what I take away from it is, yeah, it's happening. It's of great concern, but we should not in any way lose our confidence that the values that we're here to promote are somehow losing ground for reasons that are in any way inherent, or to lose confidence in our ability to promote them effectively around the world.
Do you see any surprises in these results? I know we're going to get much more to the U.S. government's role and what we can do about it, but curious if this is your map of the world too.
Yeah, I think, first of all, let me just say we very much appreciate what Freedom House has done here, and David and Arch and others. This information, this analysis is invaluable to us, and it goes along with Freedom House's advocacy and its support for human rights groups and democracy advocates around the world, so we're appreciative for all of that. I think the analysis is very sound. I think the last thing that Arch said in some ways is what's striking to me as well. We're not just talking here about the number of or type of elections. We're having a broader discussion and look at, and I think it's appropriate to say, a sustainable democracy requires a free press, it requires freedom of association, it requires transparency and accountability. These are the areas, rule of law, these are the areas where we see real significant deterioration in a number of places. And I think for us, what seems to be a growing trend, a quite dramatic trend of restrictions on civil society, official restrictions on the ability of groups to organize, to operate, to get foreign funding, all of those things. We see more and more of that, and governments seem to be learning bad lessons from one another. So that's something of great concern to us, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the course of this discussion.
Right. The autocrat's playbook and its bolstering. Is that how you see it?
Yes, I would just add one point that actually comes from the Freedom House report. The old definition by Dr. Johnson, hypocrisy is a tribute vice pays to virtue. For about 25 years, as the democratization began, there was a lot of hypocrisy in the sense that rulers claimed to be Democrats even if they weren't. There's a line in the new report in the introduction that refers to the increasing truculence of the world's most powerful authoritarian regimes. And I think that's right, that one of the things that we see also is that in places like China and Russia, they're no longer being hypocritical. They're saying, in essence, drop dead when they get criticized by human rights NGOs and by democratic governments for the terrible human rights abuses that exist. It doesn't affect the value of the democratic model, nor does it reflect any reduction in the desire for freedom on the part of their populations. But something has changed when those leaders are so brazen, or as Freedom House put it, truculent.
Arch, I wanted to ask you about a couple of the more striking findings in the report this year. Mexico, I think a lot of people here are gonna want to understand a little bit more. Okay, so a rigged election isn't necessarily the only reason you land on this list anymore, and the decline of institutions. Is decline of security in Mexico inherently putting freedom at risk, and how does that change how we think about really all sort of conflict states? Is that what this Mexico finding is about?
As David Kramer noted in his introductory remarks, Freedom in the World describes situations on the ground. It's not a governance survey. So that certainly Colombia's score in Freedom in the World was affected during the period of FARC strength, and it has improved since the FARC has declined and the degree of conflict has declined. Drug violence, organized crime violence, street violence is a factor in the freedom scores in a number of America's countries. In Mexico, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Argentina, and it's been a substantial factor in the Brazil rating. Mexico has gone beyond these other countries because you see now the drug violence affecting the press, where the press won't cover certain issues, or even editors take their cues from telephone calls they get from cartel officials. It affects the ability of local governments to effectively govern. It affects civil liberties because you've got this massive police and military presence in these states, and it affects the rights of people just to go and do their business in the streets. So it affects so many aspects of what we look at in Freedom in the World that the Mexican score declined, and we are concerned that you're seeing a kind of migration of this phenomenon from Latin America to Africa.
You know, I was going to ask about Africa next. It's not something we've touched as much on in the big picture here. You know, this was meant to be the next wave of democratization rather than that rather stark and depressing map you just showed us, suggesting, you know, a backwards trajectory in some key parts of Africa. You know, a lot of talk right now about the economic opportunities in this coming decade in Africa, and the idea that, you know, these are going to be the next round of emerging economies. How consistent is that with the portrait of political freedom that you're mapping for us today?
Our assessment of Africa showed a decline for the year, but I want to look at it in a little greater, broader context. Africa is the most volatile region in the world. We see a number of gains every year and more declines every year. So it's really, it's not a region that's moving in a positively good direction, but it's not a region that we see in decline either. And there are a number of things that we see as positive. And one of those things is the willingness, the halting willingness, but a willingness nevertheless of African countries to band together and try to deal with massive violations of human rights or of electoral norms in some of the countries, as you're seeing in Ivory Coast now. It's not clear to me that they have the will, ECOWAS has the will to really crack down on Gbagbo and make sure that justice is done in Ivory Coast, but there is an effort being made there. It's a better effort that's being made in Latin America right now to deal with Hugo Chavez. So I think that's a positive development, and we do see also some positive economic trends in Africa that we're hopeful will lead to improved freedom scores.
While I'm monopolizing you here, why don't we just finish our tour of the world? Asia. Next week, China's leader comes to Washington. This is going to be front and center in the conversation. Obviously, you continue to, you know, rate China negatively when it comes to political freedom. You know, in your written analysis, and you've emphasized the extent to which China may better symbolize than anyone else the aggressiveness of authoritarian regimes in their unwillingness to be criticized anymore. Are there any other significant changes in that China rating or in how it's affecting the Asia picture more broadly that you want to spotlight for us?
We're concerned about China's influence beyond its borders. And I can point to two countries where there were declines this year and where China has an increased economic and diplomatic presence. One is Cambodia. And Cambodia, this year we were very concerned about Cambodia taking measures against its civil society. And Cambodia is a country that has increased Chinese presence and increased economic ties to China. A second and more disturbing example is Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka has these various democratic problems, democracy problems, and they have caught the attention of the Commonwealth. And Sri Lanka is a member of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth countries have spoken out about what's going on in Sri Lanka. And President Rajapaksa has basically said, politely told the Commonwealth, to please buzz off, because we in Sri Lanka have these new economic ties to China, and they allow us we don't need the West with its human rights lectures and its talk about anti-corruption policies. We have a look east foreign policy today, and our relations with China can liberate us from this human rights colonialism. Now, by the way, there's a certain amount of bluster and bravado in what he's saying, but he's saying it, and he wouldn't have said that 10 years ago.
Okay, so human rights colonialism. Is that what the U.S. policy is when it comes to addressing these issues? And in all seriousness, obviously you're part of the, if we're delivering lectures, I imagine that falls within your brief. How would you describe more broadly what the U.S. response to a report like this is, and what's happened to the freedom agenda?
First of all, I would say we start with a commitment to the fidelity of the truth. And this report gives us a lot of information, a lot of detail about what's actually happening in the world. That's a basis for action. We don't see ourselves as being the only advocates, but a leading advocate for a support of a universal set of standards of human rights. These are not our standards, they're global standards. They very much reflect our history, our tradition, who we are as a people. And so we are proud of what we stand for, proud of what we represent in the world, and we feel that in virtually every country in the world, our advocacy, public and private, for these universal standards resonates with people who are on the receiving end of bad behavior. So I'm very proud to represent the Obama administration. The president is deeply committed to these issues, as is the secretary. Her comments today at the Bamina meeting reflect, I think, a growing outspokenness on our part, which is appropriate as we see things around the world that need to be addressed. We don't always succeed, but we are committed to a concept of principled engagement on this, a universal set of standards that we apply to the world, including ourselves, and to supporting, finally and most importantly, change from within societies. It's very difficult to force change from outside, but what we see all over the world is that people have a yearning for freedom and democracy and human rights, and our job is to reinforce their ability to change their own societies.
Just to follow up on the freedom agenda, and obviously this is a phrase very much associated with President Bush. Does President Obama have an equivalent agenda to that? Is that not necessary in such an explicit term?
Yeah, I don't know that we have a quick label. We're committed to a global policy that promotes human rights and democracy as a central priority of the United States, and that's what drives me, and it affects our relations with every country in the world. Every country that Arch in this report mentions, we are very focused on how do we promote human rights and democracy.
I'm curious what your perspective is, thinking about what the Bush approach was and how you see it differing under President Obama.
Well, I think the problems are the same. And, first, meaning the problems out in countries in the world, but secondly, the problems that any administration faces in having an effective human rights policy. And I don't think this is a very effective policy. I should stop for a moment and just say that is not meant to be criticism of Michael Posner. I actually walked in his shoes about 4,000 years ago in the Reagan administration, and the Human Rights Bureau in any administration has a set of natural enemies. The Latin America Bureau, the East Asia Bureau, the Europe Bureau, the Near East Bureau. So that struggle continues. I would say that the problem, as I see it, is the gap between administration rhetoric and actual bilateral policies. That is, what penalty is imposed on the dictator when he closes newspapers or arrests opposition people? That's really the question. Otherwise it's just speeches, and they will ultimately be ignored by the people on the receiving end. And that's where I think the administration has been weak. That is, the verbiage has sometimes been good. Sometimes. The Secretary did not use the word democracy or the words human rights in her speech in Doha, which I think was unfortunate. But it's the consequences that are missing. It's the connection between actual bilateral relations with the United States. And I think if people don't pay a price, then they start ignoring the speeches.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I couldn't disagree with that more. I think we are increasingly in a range of discussions with other governments, making clear the link between how they perform, how they act on human rights and democracy, and their ability to work with us as a close ally or as a partner. It doesn't mean everything is in the public domain. Some of it is, some of it isn't, but we are, whether it's China or Egypt or Russia, the hardest place is Pakistan. We are very much engaged in a very serious set of discussions, Uzbekistan, very much engaged in discussions where at the table is security concerns and economic concerns. Human rights issues are very much part of that agenda, and we're making it explicit and clear. But it's a whole of government approach, that there is really a need for governments that want to be close to the United States to take these things seriously.
Tom, I'm curious how it looks to you, having closely observed both the Bush approach and now the Obama approach, and thinking back as well to Arch's map here. You have the first part of the decade and the latter. Do you see a connection between what different U.S. administrations do and how that affects the work of outside advocates?
Sorry. Well, there are obviously all kinds of fascinating and dramatic differences, but I think what's more interesting is to look at what all these administrations have in common, and I think some of the fundamental obstacles that we face, I think collectively, as we try to promote an effective American approach to these problems around the world, that those problems are ever present in every administration. I think every administration makes a choice when it looks at human rights problems in countries like China or Burma or Egypt or Iran or Venezuela or Mexico or what have you, between trying to manage the problem and trying to solve the problem. And it is the natural tendency of sort of the soul of the State Department to try to manage the problem and not to solve the problem. Managing the problem means, there are demonstrations on the streets in Tunisia, and you got to say something. And you sit around, and I've been in these meetings inside government, and people wonder, okay, what is the minimum we have to say or do in order to satisfy all of the constituencies that are pressing us on this issue, that we are dealing with a problem. So you issue a statement, maybe that will do it. Raise it in a meeting, create the impression that we're really engaged. And sometimes you can manage the theater of these things so effectively that it really does look like you're profoundly engaged. But no one around that table has actually, for a moment, asked the question, okay, forget about all the constituencies and Human Rights Watch and Freedom House and the members of Congress that are writing to us. What would it actually take to solve this problem, to win rather than lose? Now, with this administration, you see an example of trying to solve the problem in the approach to Sudan. What happened there was the President of the United States said to his people, we are going to do everything we humanly can. Maybe we'll fail miserably. We may argue with each other, as they did many times and continue to do, but we are going to use every element of national power we can muster to try to solve this problem. And you've seen, I think, an extraordinary effort that has been about as successful as it can be under those difficult circumstances. I think the president reacted that way to the crisis in Ivory Coast. It hit him personally. I think he called his team together and said, do everything you can. I think there are other examples where I think you see the opposite extreme. For example, Burma, where I think there's an enormous gulf between theater and action. All kinds of extraordinarily wonderful statements about how much we care about democracy there, how much we admire Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burmese opposition. I could not have written them better myself. Wonderful, wonderful public statements, but absolutely no action on sanctions, accountability, no use of the numerous diplomatic and economic tools that the United States has to affect matters on the ground. Tunisia, we'll see. I think so far we've sort of seen statements of concern. I haven't seen a sign that the team has been called together and ordered to solve the problem. So I think that's the distinction. And our job as advocates is to try to always get them from managing the problem to solving the problem. And one of the obstacles we face is that we're sometimes part of the problem because they see the solution as being satisfying us. And we have to convince them, no, you're not here to satisfy us. You're actually here to solve the problem. And those are sometimes two different things.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you made that distinction because I was curious how you would define solution. Elliot, you were chuckling at the description of those meetings that I'm sure you've sat in many of those yourself. Do you think we're any farther along in having our own U.S. template or playbook for what to do when a country goes in this direction? Mexico, for example?
I don't. And I don't say that critically of the Obama administration. I think here it is typical of, go back 25 or 35 years. I don't think we've solved a significant problem, which, I can define in three words, the State Department. For example, the degree of teaching of State Department personnel, new ambassadors, who are about to go out in the field to a non-democratic country, of how you do this. I mean, the use of the experience of people who've been successful ambassadors, men and women who have served in those countries and done a bang-up job. Institutionally, the department, it does some of this, but it doesn't do enough, and it doesn't do it very well. And it's pretty rare for somebody to have his or her career really advanced because this person was a terrific human rights advocate. On the contrary, the bureaucracy, again, under every secretary, the bureaucracy pushes up the next person in line. It goes by seniority. So that I don't want to get into names, but I think if you look at the names, it's bureaucratic. It isn't a reward for terrific performance in a place like Venezuela or a place like Egypt or a place like Cuba, or one could go on. So I don't think the department has learned a lot as we go through the decades, which means that the leadership has to come from outside. It comes from the president. It comes from the assistant secretary for human rights. It comes from the secretary. Or it doesn't come at all because it's not a natural product. I think the reason is, let me just go on for one more second, it's not because people are evil. If you are an ambassador, or let's say an AID mission director, you have many, many goals in most of these countries. The United States has many varied interests. And even if you're not interested in, your job is not high politics or military issues, let's say you're the AID mission director, you're interested in schools, you're interested in hospitals, you're interested in children's nutrition. And you've got to work with that government. And now here come the human rights people, and they're making trouble for you. And they're going to make it more difficult to work with that government. So you're not going, in most cases, to like that. And again, it means that the secretary, the assistant secretary, the White House has to come in and force you to that troublesome agenda of human rights. And the bureaucracy always resists. So it is a never-ending, what's the term? Never-ending battle for truth, justice, the American way.
Susan, could I jump in with this? So we're talking about the State Department culture here, which all of us but Mike can talk about. Reading the WikiLeaks cables, I think, brings out something very, very interesting, which I think most of us, certainly all of us who've worked there, have always been aware of, and that is there's this extraordinarily dramatic gulf between what American diplomats know and what they say. I mean, if you look at these cables, especially on in terms of how diplomats address the issues we're talking about, they're incredibly intelligent, incisive, honest, candid, no illusions whatsoever about the nature of some of the authoritarian regimes that we deal with, and also no illusions about the potential consequences of those problems for American national interests. But, you put one of those same people in front of a microphone or ask them to write the readout of the bilateral meeting after the fact, and it's, we value our relationship with country X and we're moving forward together in a spirit of partnership. And, there are obviously sound reasons for there being some gulf, but how wide it is, I think, is interesting. And maybe one comment on a particularly specific WikiLeaks cable that I was reading this morning, I found very interesting, the ones from Tunisia. An example of the phenomenon that I mentioned, where the cables are extremely explicit, extremely honest about the degree of repression and corruption in that authoritarian country, talking about how, if you own anything of value in Tunisia, the president and his wife may steal it. Things very, very, very explicit. And all of our people who work in and on Tunisia have told us that the release of those cables is a contributing factor in the unrest there. Not because they told people in Tunisia anything that they didn't know already about their country. Of course, every Tunisian knows that they live in a corrupt authoritarian country. But the release nevertheless helped to undermine the legitimacy of that regime by showing how much outsiders were aware of its fundamental rottenness, and that rottenness was a source of shame for the country around the world. So this is a good example of a public statement made by American diplomats about the rottenness and corruption of an authoritarian regime that had a significant impact, it turns out, on events on the ground, except the statement was totally inadvertent. It wasn't deliberate. And yet almost every American diplomat one talks to will argue that making those public statements deliberately has absolutely no impact whatsoever. And it turns out they did it inadvertently, and inadvertently had an impact.
Okay, well, that's an incredibly provocative point, I think, to put out to this group. Mike, I'm curious how you would respond to that. And also, I understand that WikiLeaks is a part of your portfolio in some ways right now, and I'm curious if maybe you can also tell us a little bit more broadly what you think some of the consequences have been and when will be from those disclosures.
Let me just say at the outset, this is really a reaction to a couple of comments about, managing versus doing. I came into government 16 months ago, having spent a long time outside. And what's really been striking to me, somewhat at odds with what both of my colleagues around this table have said, is the extent to which the secretary in particular and other senior people in the department are very focused on a results-oriented approach. To the extent that we're managing because the media and external forces here want public commentary on everything. There is a debate about public versus private, there's no doubt. Some cases public commentary is actually a useful tool of diplomacy, sometimes it's not. Secondly, long-term versus short-term. There is an impatience in our own country about, why haven't we solved the problem today? And I think part of what we're looking at is what are the things we can do in the short term, but also what's a long-term strategy for dealing with an Egypt or a China. And third, and in some ways the most important to me, where I find a disconnect between the debate and the reality, is a question of how do you actually navigate change. And it comes back to what Art said at the beginning. I really believe that change occurs from within a society. We can amplify voices, we can provide a lifeline of protection, we can provide all kinds of financial and other support. But I think it is generally the case that it is very difficult to force change from outside. Societies change because people in those societies have the ability, capacity, motivation to basically navigate change within their own society, subject to their own customs, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm a big believer in that. I always have been, and I've been encouraged actually by the extent to which people in this administration, who are the people I'm reporting to and working with, are very supportive of that agenda. I think we're making progress in a lot of places. Again, I don't want to get into every detail, but I do have a sense that there's a recognition of those factors. WikiLeaks, again, there's all sorts of things I'm not supposed to say. What I can say is whether whatever you're reading is real or not, there is clearly a risk to a whole slew of people. And part of my job now, my new normal, and people in my bureau, is trying to figure out how we protect people who are inadvertently and unwittingly and unknowingly often now the subject of official reprisals because of their mention in those cables, and there are a lot of them. And so that's part of what we're trying to do. It's a sad and unfortunate consequence of the disclosure.
Do you think it's possible that there could be positive results as well, or at least a sort of unintended consequences a la the Tunisia cable that Tom is talking about?
Look, I think anybody, again, I'm not supposed to say that anything in there is real, but to the extent that somebody wants to draw the conclusion that it's real, if you read a lot of the cables, you do get a sense that there's a lot of time and energy that goes into these subjects. It is not a trivial, it's not just a throwaway line. There are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of U.S. officials who spend an awful lot of time not just analyzing, but trying to figure out how to help real people in need. It's a very dedicated federal government committed to these things.
Arch, I thought this would be a good transition to go back to something that that Mike just said, which is, what levers does the United States have to affect your map in any way? What's the trajectory, short-term versus long-term? Well, your long-term trends on some level are very disturbing. We're talking about a 5-year decline, the first since you recorded this in 1972. Have you ever been able to look or come up with a metric where you can talk about outside factors and how that can bring a country up or down?
I'll mention two things. One, which is not the United States, it's the EU. If you look at the countries that have been most severely affected by the economic downturn, these are the countries of Western Europe, and especially of the new Europe countries of the former communist world. And what we have seen, though, is that as severely as these countries have been hit by the downturn, their adherence to the standards of democracy has been pretty solid. And the reason is because they want to be part of the EU. They want to adhere to the rules that the EU has set up for how countries are governed. And therefore, the backsliding in our survey has been minimal. Now, we have an interesting case emerging right now in Hungary, where you have Viktor Orban, the new president, who has a majority of over 2/3. He can pretty much do whatever he wants. He has given evidence of a somewhat authoritarian mindset. He's already taken some measures that Freedom House disapproves of, other EU countries disapprove of, and thus and so. And we'll see how the EU handles that. But that will be an interesting case. But thus far, the EU model has been a good model for handling these kinds of tensions. Second, the United States has a policy, has a program. It was established during the Bush administrations. It has been continued under the Obama administration. It's called the Millennium Challenge Account. It gives money. It's a foreign assistance program that gives money to economically poor countries, and they have to meet a certain number of benchmarks, and some of those benchmarks are democracy, human rights, and good governance benchmarks. When I started at Freedom House 16 years ago, we hardly ever met with the diplomats of foreign countries. And ever since the MCA has been instituted, we are inundated with requests from foreign ministers and ministers of development and their American flags to meet and discuss our rankings, because our rankings actually are a formal part of the MCA decision-making criteria. So I would say that is a program that shows it's a lever. It's a real lever that the United States government has. We will give you money if you will govern your society justly. Now, this will only have an effect over poorer countries, not geostrategically important countries, not these big authoritarian monsters like China, Russia, Egypt, Venezuela, countries that have energy riches and can stand on their own and can tell the rest of the world to buzz off. But it is the kind of program that will get at a certain set of countries that do rely on America and other democracies for approval and assistance.
One striking finding that we haven't discussed much today yet is that with your change in the rating of Ukraine, all of the countries of the former Soviet Union are now rated as in some form or another of not free 20 years after.
Partly free or not
Yeah,
free.
exactly.
That's right.
After the break of the Soviet Union. I find that to be striking. I mean, the common sort of analysis of sort of the freedom narrative, right, is that there was a massive sort of tectonic plate shift in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, in many ways, I'm wondering what's the framework that we all have for understanding how 2 decades later, not a single one of those countries has moved into the category we would have expected them to be in, frankly, for most of that period.
Well, we have a
EU,
special,
I guess that's the
well,
EU factor
we,
there.
we have, we act technically, we describe this region as the non-Baltic former Soviet Union. The Baltics are lumped in with Central
Right,
Europe.
right.
So,
Well, and they are the only part
Yeah.
of the former Soviet Union to belong to
Right.
the EU.
right. I don't have a overarching explanation for this very big problem, but I will say one thing. When the leading power in the region is moving aggressively into the authoritarian category, and which is projecting its influence beyond its borders, and which is providing diplomatic cover for the authoritarian countries in its periphery, and which is aggressing on, in various ways, democratic countries in its neighborhood, then that has an influence. And I would say that the Russia factor has to be factored in. Sure, Central Asia has never had a terribly great spirit of democracy and freedom. There are problems throughout this region, but I would say the chances for reform have been profoundly affected by the Putinization of Russia. And you find this in other parts of the world. I think Chavez has had an impact on parts of Latin America in a very negative way. And I think you're finding that China is having an impact in its neighborhood as well. And Iran is having a deleterious impact in its neighborhood.
Tom, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, but I think it's also important to remember that it's not like most of these countries had democratic revolutions in 1989 or 1991. With respect to Central Asia, I've always thought that what happened in 1991 was that the Soviet Union retreated to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, etc. Those newly independent quote unquote countries were governed from the start by the same elites, and in many cases the same individuals who governed them as the appointed governors of the Soviet Union in its last decade, and continue to use the same methods. right down to, the use of mental hospitals to incarcerate dissidents. So, particularly Soviet methods of repression, which we still see in that part of the world. So it's not like there was this dramatic change for the better and then, everything went south. And I think the same could be said for Azerbaijan, Armenia to some extent. Georgia was in a state of conflict and chaos in that period immediately after 1991. So it was really only the Baltic states who, from the very, very beginning, had this democratic awakening, and which continued to move in that direction. So, yeah, not surprising.
We'd love to get to your questions as well today. I know there's going to be a lot. Let me just ask, there are microphones that are floating around, and let me just ask you to identify yourself and the group that you're with, if you could, when you have a question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Heba Al-Qudsi. I'm from Al Masri Al-Yawm, Egyptian journalist. I want to ask about the Middle East area, and it's considered one of the most important areas that lack freedom and democracy. About this sectarian violence in Egypt and the violent demonstration in Tunis, do you think this demonstration and violence will lead to or will push the government in these two countries and in the other countries in the Middle East to take some steps towards democracy and freedom? Do you think that violence from the people will push the government to take some further steps toward that democracy and freedom? And my other question, how to deal with this government that respond to any external pressure towards any democratic steps, that it is some kind of interference in its internal affairs? Thank you.
Take that one on.
Sure. First of all, on Egypt and then Tunisia, I traveled to Egypt twice last year. I plan to go back again soon. Very concerned about a range of human rights issues there, including the sectarian tensions between Christians and Muslims. I was there last year, several weeks after the Nag Hammadi killings. We've continued to press on for accountability for those killings. We are continuing to press also on a whole range of other issues relating to political freedom, free press, the issues relating to bloggers. The emergency law obviously had great concerns about the elections last year as well. So there clearly is a big agenda, a big human rights agenda. We don't support or endorse violence as a reaction to those problems or for any other reason. We also recognize that we have an important relationship with the Egyptian government, but I think we have to operate on multiple tracks. And one of those tracks is to support Egyptian civil society, which includes a number of people, human rights advocates, women's groups, religious activists who feel very frustrated with the current state of affairs. So we're very focused on it, very aware of the tensions and the challenges, but going to continue to speak out about that. Tunisia as well, there clearly in the last few weeks has been a level of violence and reaction to things domestically that I think probably startled everybody. Again, we don't endorse that violence. I don't know where it's going to lead, but we have had a range of human rights concerns. It is a very tightly controlled environment where political activity is very difficult, where press again is very constrained, and where people in the human rights movement for a long time have felt very isolated and targeted. So we continue to raise those concerns. We have a very strong ambassador there who's been raising these issues for his entire tenure. I don't know, again, I can't predict, and my job is not to predict where it's going, but I would say those are two countries among many in the region where the human rights issues are important, increasingly important, and we recognize part of our bilateral relationship is to address them in a serious way.
Okay. Should we get another one? Right here. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, hi, it's Andrew Albertson, no affiliation right now, recently of the Project on Middle East Democracy. My question is just the Congress. Congress just changed. Republicans are now have the House, and I'm wondering if any of you think that might affect the U.S. approach to these issues, what levers House Republicans might have, and any speculation on that.
Tom?
I think Elliot should answer that question. I don't know what Republicans are going to do.
The answer is of course, it's all for the better that the Republicans took the. There are going to be some issues on which there are not any, have not been, and are not any partisan differences. It may turn more on the individuals who take over. For example, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in the House Foreign Affairs Committee will have somewhat different interests from those of Howard Berman. But I don't think there will be huge discontinuities. I think the questions that arise are the same questions. For a very, very good example, Egypt. I disagree with some of the things Mike said, because I think we shouldn't have a multi-track policy. We should have a one-track policy in which, if the government of Egypt engages in the kind of human rights violations in which it has engaged, where the 2010 election is much worse than the 2005 election, then there has to be a penalty. There has to be a consequence. And there isn't a consequence. And in the past year, what we've seen instead is that President Mubarak comes here and he is given a glorious reception because of the Middle East peace process, close quote. Big mistake. Because the message that is learned by the government of Egypt is, we're getting away with it. So the question to me is, will this Congress be different from all the previous Congresses which have stepped back and which have said, no, we have too many things at stake with Egypt. We don't want to cut a nickel from the foreign aid program. So it's the same questions. And, if you were looking at the track record, you'd say they're going to be the same answers, because the control of the House and Senate has changed over the last 25 years, yet there hasn't been that much discontinuity.
Sorry, I promised you in the glasses there.
Eli Lake, Washington Times. It's a question for Mr. Posner. Can you say a little bit more about the steps that your office is taking to protect people mentioned in the WikiLeaks cables? And can you specifically talk about the cable that mentioned Morgan Tsvangirai in Zimbabwe, I guess privately saying that he would favor some sanctions on Zimbabwe? Are you doing anything to help him right now, protect him? Are you talking to the government there?
I'm not going to get into details of any individual reaction. What we've said publicly, and I'll say it again, is we have identified literally hundreds of people who we think are at some risk. We've set up a task force in the State Department. There are 30 people working on this on a pretty steady basis. We have reached out to many, many governments to express our concerns and to make clear that we are watching very closely their actions, and that we regard it as a very important, again, a very important criteria, a very important aspect of our relationship, and that in some cases we have and will continue to explore alternatives to make sure that people are protected and safe. I'm not going to say more than that about his case or any other.
My name is Robin Hassan. I'm from Al Hurra TV channel in Washington, D.C. My question is, you've been talking about the support you're giving to the regimes in the Middle East, like Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, all these regimes in the Middle East. And on the other side, you have minimal support to the civil societies in these countries. So how do you expect the civil society to improve in democracy while you are supporting the regimes in the Middle East with huge aids, actually?
This is probably another place where Elliot Abrams and I may not agree. I think it's a critical piece of what we need to be looking at. And I think we have, in the last several years, for a range of reasons, not been as focused on the various ways, both formally and informally, the U.S. government can be supportive of civil society, both rhetorically, financially, technically. Those groups are the lifeblood of a democracy and human rights movement. We need to be both amplifying their voices and protecting them and what they do. So in my visits to the region, that's the centerpiece of what I'm focused on. I talk to the governments, we have an exchange of views on a range of things, but I'm very, very mindful of the critical role that civil society plays. Secretary Clinton gave a speech in Krakow in July at the Community of Democracies where she focused on the growing restrictions on civil society. That is not a one-of. It's now an important piece of our agenda. When the Secretary travels, as she did today, she meets routinely with members of civil society in a very public way. I was with her in Central Asia last month. She did it. She's done it this week around her trip to the Middle East. We are doing a range of things now to find ways to reinforce and extend our support to civil society. It's an important piece of the human rights policy of this administration. So there's a lot going on. More will go on in the future.
Is that something you disagree with?
No.
Just to clarify here. Okay. Fred.
Thank you. Fred Hyatt from Washington Post editorial page. Thank you for an illuminating discussion. If I read the chart correctly, Iraq is listed as not free. And I understand that there's still violence there and pressures on civil society. But there have also been a series of, I thought, reasonably free elections and fairly vibrant media and civil society. And I'm curious why it ends up in the same category as its neighbor Iran, and whether Secretary Posner and other members of the panel think that's an accurate designation.
Iraq is listed as a not free country for certain of the same reasons that Mexico is listed as a partly free country today. Yes, Iraq had a series of reasonably good elections. Iraq's government, however, and we do look at effectiveness of government, has, well, it was non-existent for most of 2010. The level of corruption in Iraq is pervasive. We look at religious tolerance, freedom of belief, it's a problem. You look at freedom of the press, there are more journalists killed in Iraq than in most other countries. We look at the rule of law, there are serious problems there. So if you go up and down the list of checklists that we look at as part of our methodology, Iraq simply belongs in the not free category. If you look at the more granular point spreads that we have, Iraq has a stronger ranking certainly than Iran does. But it is still, I think we feel comfortable that it belongs in the not free category, because to be a democratic state, to be a free or a partly free state, you have to have a decent score on a broad range of indicators, and Iraq doesn't have those.
Do anyone want to challenge that?
I would just say, I just was looking, Venezuela gets partly free here. So I think that that's not right. And it seems to me that there are some inconsistencies. I think it's always going to be the case that at the margin between not free and partly free, or between partly free and free, there are always going to be difficulties. It's quite clear there's no magic formula here. But it does seem to me that Iraq has a good argument for creeping over into partly free.
Either of you both comfortable with where Iraq is?
Yeah, I'm not, I don't understand, frankly, quite how the ratings are done, and I don't want to start speculating on countries. I would say Iraq is clearly in a critical transitional moment. Hope springs eternal. There is now a government coming together, and we certainly are going to do everything we can to reinforce it. The aspect that we've been most focused on in recent weeks and months is the continued tension among the religious communities, and in particular some of the continuing challenges to Christian and other minority communities. Those issues loom large, and those are issues we're very focused on. But there is, we're in a very critical moment. The next 6 months to a year is critical, and again, for us, trying to figure out how to work constructively and supportively with an emerging government is a key priority.
Okay. Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Maryam Memar Sadeghi, and I work with the human rights community, civil society in Iran. My question is about the crackdown on civil society and society at large in Iran since the June 2009 election, and what anyone on the panel thinks the U.S. could have done differently, could have done better at the time of the election and since to promote democracy and human rights, and particularly in context of the nuclear portfolio and the intersection between the U.S. pursuing its security interests and the U.S. pursuing its interest in a free and democratic Iran. What could the U.S. have done better? Thanks.
Can I just, well, I think that I think President Reagan's attitude toward the Soviet Union is a lesson here. He did actually engage the Soviets, and he did actually negotiate face-to-face with every Soviet leader who, if you think back, lived long enough to meet him, because there was this fast changeover. Meanwhile, denouncing them and saying you're going to end up on the ash heap of history. So I think you can do both. And the obvious and important security questions should not stop us, in the case of Iran or any other case, from a strong position in favor of democracy and human rights. In fact, I would argue that if you're thinking about engaging Iran, which may be misinterpreted as a diminution of your concern about human rights there, and certainly the regime is going to lie about it and try to present it as a reduction in concern, it's all the more important to be very, very vocal. I think the question of what practically we can do is obviously one that the Human Rights Bureau is thinking about a lot. It's dangerous. The regime is going to be trying to prevent it. There are a lot of brave people in Iran who are fighting for their freedom, and the question is how effectively to help them. And I'm sure it's not an easy question. There is an easy part of it, though, and I think that's the verbal part. And I think that my own view would be the administration, in the immediate aftermath of the election of 2009, was not sufficiently vocal in supporting the Green Movement, and should, for example, next week there's going to be a negotiation. That's a great occasion to make another endorsement of the Green Movement, to make sure the regime cannot present these meetings as anything other than what they are, cannot present them as meaning we don't care about human rights.
The first question is what should the United States do? And I think what I would argue is that the U.S. interest with Iran lies in policies that divide the Iranian government from its people rather than policies that unite the Iranian government from its people. That's the long-term interest. And unfortunately, pursuing the nuclear file, although it's absolutely necessary, obviously from a wide range of reasons, can have a tendency to unite the Iranian government with its people. And that's why it's extremely important, I think, from a very hard-headed point of view, for the United States simultaneously to be seen as on the side of those Iranians, young Iranians in particular, who want change in their country. Because otherwise it's very easy for the Ahmadinejad government to, to sort of use the popular nationalist support for Iran standing up to the West on the nuclear file to bolster its own internal standing and legitimacy. So I think, number one, there's a very, very powerful national interest case to be made for any administration to be doing this. And two, I agree with Elliot that the main thing here is to get the words and the symbols right, because we don't have too many direct levers in the case of Iran. There are ways to support the opposition from the outside, particularly through broadcasting, communications, promoting safe technologies for getting around internet firewalls and so forth. But the words do really matter, and we know they matter because dissidents inside Iran have consistently told us that it matters a great deal to them, and I trust them. As far as the Obama administration, I think the very first few months of the Obama administration, there was a somewhat unfortunate tendency to kind of be against whatever the previous team was perceived as being for. I think there was some hesitancy in the opening days of the Green Revolution in terms of how to speak out about it. I think that was fairly well corrected, really in sort of a matter of the weeks and days that was going on. I think the administration ended up saying the right things, and they've been particularly aggressive and effective in countering Iran in international fora at the United Nations and preventing them from being elected to the UN Human Rights Council and to this new UN Women's Organization. Campaigns that weren't easy because Iran cared a great deal about the legitimacy that it could gain by winning membership in these bodies, and I think that the administration very effectively countered Iran, and there'll be more opportunities this year to do that. So I think I think this is one that they get, and they're increasingly getting better at.
Okay, I'm told we have time for just one more question. Yeah. Well, we're going to give it to you because I'm afraid we'll have to go to another one if not. So.
Kasım Cindemir, Habertürk Daily. Can you please comment on Turkey? Is Turkey becoming more democratic or more authoritarian? And it's also listed as partly free. The reasons behind that, please. A comment from everyone, if possible.
Turkey is always a challenge for our survey, and one of the reasons is because Turks themselves are so incredibly polarized. I'd say the degree of political polarization there makes what we're experiencing in the United States look like a piece of cake, really. We regard Turkey as a high-scoring, partly free country that has made a number of important reforms, both before the Erdogan government and during the Erdogan government. In the rule of law, in minority rights, in relations with the Kurds, in certain governance areas, Erdogan has made some important reforms. I would say over the past year or so, there have been certain developments that have raised some small alarm bells at Freedom House. They haven't necessarily brought the score down more than a small amount, but we've been very concerned, especially about the Turkish government's treatment of the press. Erdogan seems to regard those in the press who are his critics as his enemies, and he has taken, he and the prosecutors have taken measures against the press that we find bothersome, because there is a pattern, a global pattern, whereby even democratically inclined leaders, when they start to move in an authoritarian direction, the first target is the press, and we're seeing that now in Turkey.
Anyone else on Turkey? Thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Susan, thank you very much. When we were putting a panel together, we were trying to get a thoughtful, provocative group, and think it's very fair to say that our panelists here and Susan, thanks to your expert moderating, have fulfilled that goal. So please join me in thanking our panelists and Susan for a terrific discussion today. Thank you all for coming.